You guys ever think about how expensive Landfall is? Not in terms of whenever you're playing the game, how much cards cost in terms of mana value. I'm just talking about how much money it costs to play. Landfall is one of the most fun archetypes to play in Commander. You've got all kinds of unique synergies that help you draw cards, make a bunch of mana, do a bunch of really fun things. And you've got creatures like Tatiova, Omnath. These are really powerful creatures that many people in Commander like to play. But when you actually sit down to build your first Landfall deck, it can get very expensive to buy. Between fetch lands, dual lands, special cards that go directly in Landfall decks, and other synergies that Landfall can have associated with it, these decks can get to be not just hundreds, but thousands of dollars in price. Now, I build a lot of decks. I build decks that are expensive and powerful, but I also love building decks that are budget focused. And in my opinion, budget should never be a reason why somebody shouldn't be able to play Commander. And we should also, as a community, be encouraging budget players to be able to come to the game night with as much power as they possibly can for their budget. So when I went to MagicCon Vegas this year, I had the opportunity to go to the preview panel for Edge of Eternities, which is coming out in just a couple of days as of recording this video. And I really fell in love with all the different cards. Let's be honest, I fell in love with all of the sick art treatments for the full art basics. I fell in love with some of the really powerful cards that they spoiled. But I saw one card in particular that got me really excited to build around. Not because it was going to be the most powerful card or I was immediately going to throw it into one of my current decks, but I saw it as an opportunity to build a Commander deck and an archetype that is inherently expensive to buy. And so when I saw Tanook, Memorial, Ensign, I just knew that there was something here, a deck that we could build, that we could put together for a very tight budget and still have a ton of fun. We're not substituting power for having less money in our pocket. No, we are still going to be bringing a very powerful, synergistic deck to game night that is going to be able to win you games while keeping some money in your wallet. Now, before we get started, I just want to take a second to introduce myself. My name is ClearReason, and I love to build Commander decks, but more importantly, I love to share with this community. And I thought it would be great to start this YouTube channel, not just so that I can have an outlet for creativity and show people what decks that I'm thinking of or brewing up, but more importantly, find a way for myself to give back to the community. Only a couple of years ago, I was in the position where I bought my first precon, I went online and learned how to upgrade it, I built my first deck from scratch, and now I'm building bracket 3, bracket 4 decks on a daily basis. And so I feel like this is a great opportunity for me to share what I've learned with the community. And if we can find ways to connect and have fun along the way, I just think that's great for everyone. And that's the gathering that we all talk about. So that being said, let's get into the deck tech. Let's talk about Tanook, Memorial Ensign. Now, this is a very fun commander because he is not just Gruul Landfall. He's not just a payoff for doing Landfall things, but he is a draw engine in the command zone. So let's take a moment to take a look at the commander. So Tanook Memorial Ensign costs 1 generic, a red, and a green. It has Landfall. Whenever a land you control enters, Tanook deals 1 damage to each opponent. And the second time that this ability triggers each turn, we get to draw a card. Now, right off the bat, Tanook is a great Landfall payoff. I knew when I saw this was going to just be a great little card draw engine or a payoff for most Landfall decks. But the area that this gets really fun is when we start talking about some of the other creatures that we can synergize with, and more importantly, some of the really powerful enchantments that help us draw additional cards and do some really powerful things on a tight budget. Being an uncommon, Tanook is a card that I knew would be coming in at somewhere around 50 cents if he was popular, but I knew that this was a commander deck that could still punch above its weight, and if we built it the right way, we would be able to still have a ton of fun. I think I've threaded the needle here, trying to find that balance between finding budget alternatives in an archetype that's very expensive to build, while still giving you enough power and consistency to be able to go toe-to-toe with your other bracket 2 decks, or even some bracket level 3 decks whenever you go to your local game store and may want to bring this deck out. Just to give you a quick overview of the price, you will see all of the pricing that I'm going to be using for my videos is through cardkingdom.com. I do not have an affiliation with Card Kingdom. They are my preferred digital vendor when it comes to buying my cards online. But the main reason I'm using Card Kingdom is for, number one, consistency. When you look at the cards online through Card Kingdom, those prices are going to be very representative of what you're going to get when you finally check out. And the second reason is for convenience. Whenever you buy through Card Kingdom, you get one package, it all shows up at your door. I remember when I was building my first deck, and it's a very daunting task to say, okay, so I need to go on the TCG Player app, or I need to go down to my local game store, and I need to talk to like 5 different vendors on TCG Player to find all these different cards. One vendor has it for this price, but it's got free shipping. One vendor has it for higher price, but you have to, or for a lower price, but you have to pay for the shipping. So for me, in terms of consistency, in terms of simplicity, Card Kingdom has been a great vendor for me. So as of recording, this deck is $47.36 through cardkingdom.com. And if we wanted to, so this is showing you with the cards already in my collection, but if we wanted to look at TCG Player, you could save some money. On TCG Player, they've got it listed for $29.89, but I've found that it's not always as consistent when you're looking at the prices through Moxfield on TCG Player. I'd rather have it be as consistent as I can for you. So currently we're looking at just shy of $50 to get this entire deck. That's around the price of a pre-con that's currently out there on the market, probably a little bit less. Now, let's start to kind of dive into the deck. Let's talk about some of the synergies we've got going, and let's start where we always should start, and is honestly extremely important in a landfall deck, and that's the lands. So I wanted to start off by talking about the fact that even in a budget list, we still have 10 fetch lands. I usually like to, whether it's a budget deck or a full price, no budget limit, I like to have about 10 fetches in my deck. That gives me enough ability to fetch for the colors that I need. But when we're building on a really tight budget, we can't just jam a bunch of the most powerful fetches in the format, because some of those can be $20, $30 each. So let's take a look at what we've got here and some of the ways we've creatively gotten around the fact that we have a tight budget. So the first one in this list is Evolving Wilds. Sack it, go get a basic. Field of Ruin. This one taps for colorless, but if we pay 2 mana and sack it, not only can we interact with our opponent's lands, but we can also go get a basic and replace this land from the library. Myriad Landscape, classic ramp piece, and goes and fetches us 2 basics. Prismatic Vein also has the ability for us to pay 1 and sack it to go get a basic. Terramorphic Expanse, sack it, go get a basic. We've got Warped Landscape, pay 2, sack it, go get a basic. Pay 2, sack it, go get a basic, and go destroy somebody else's land. So we're using not just the ability to sack our own stuff and go get it back, but we're also using the fact that we can interact with our opponent's stuff to do the same thing. Blighted Woodlands lets us go get 2 basics. Escape Tunnel lets us sack it and go get a basic, but we could also give a target creature unblockable until the end of the turn. And finally, we have Mountain Valley, which is a tapped fetch land that lets us go get a mountain or a forest card. So this will let us fetch for a lot of the duels that we have in the deck. This deck has a total of 43 lands in it. And the reason that we've got a total of 43 lands is because that statistically will ensure that we get at least 3 lands in the opening hand, and we should be getting one within the next 2 cards that we draw. I've found that 43 lands is the sweet spot. It allows you to have a ton of lands for your landfall synergy, but not so many, because I've seen some folks run like 44, 45, 46. We don't want to run too many because we have to have plenty of our other stuff to make this happen. So let's look at some of the lands that we've also got here in the deck. Path of Ancestry, that's going to help us get our colors. We've got Temple of the False God. Since we do have heavy on the lands, we're going to be able to hit that 5 land requirement to have it tap for double colorless. We've got Gruul Turf in the list, which is a bounce land. So when you play it, it enters tapped and you return a land to the hand. This will let us ramp by having an additional mana, but then it'll also put a land back in our hand to ensure that we can continue to hit our lands. Cinderglade will enter tapped unless we have 2 or more basics, and this deck has a lot of basics to help us hit that pricing threshold. We have Command Tower, Exotic Orchard, we have Game Trail, Mossfire Valley, Temple of Abandon, Highland Forest. All of those are to help us hit our colors. And then we have 10 basic mountains and 12 basic forests in the deck. That's going to round out our mana base here. I think one important thing, especially if you're building a deck on a budget, is to put in a ton of basics. I know we're in Landfall, so that's kind of a given part of the strategy, but when you're thinking about ways to bring down the cost of a deck, think about how many dual lands can I really run and what dual lands am I going to be running. You'll notice that we've got scry lands, we've got the filter lands, we've got lands that have very strict requirements of either, having mountains or basics. If you look at some of these cards, and this one, for example, Highland Forest, it just comes in tapped. It has no ability to come in untapped. So look at the tap lands, look at your lands that do tap for multiple colors, but look at the ones that are not normally played and what restrictions you can use. Otherwise, if it doesn't fit within your budget, we're looking at basic lands. And in a 2-color deck or a monocolor deck, that's not a problem because we're going to be able to tap for our colors most of the time. And our commander is going to give us the ability to fix those colors as we keep drawing more cards. And while I'm talking about drawing cards, let's go back up here and talk about the card draw package. So we've talked about how we're going to get a bunch of lands into play, but now let's talk about how we synergize with those. How do we get those lands into our hand and start casting more spells? The first card I want to talk about in this section is Magmatic Insight. You discard a land and you can draw 2 cards. Scale the Heights. This one is a fantastic version that is kind of an upgrade to Explore, which is on this list. So Explore lets you play an additional land this turn and draw a card. But Scale the Heights lets you play an additional land, draw a card, and it lets us put a +1/+1 counter on a creature and gain 2 life. So for 1 extra mana, we're doing some additional synergies with our deck. Now, this is another fun one. This is Cleansing Wildfire. Destroy target land. Its controller may search their library for a basic, put it onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle, and we draw a card. The situation where we've got an opponent that has a land that needs to be removed, maybe they've got a Cabal Coffers, maybe they've got a Yavimaya. If there's a card that needs to be removed from our opponent, we could do that. But if we need to, instead, we can take that Cleansing Wildfire and use it on our own land. Look in our library, replace it with a basic, and draw a card as well. So these are some of the things we can do to hit additional landfall triggers in a budget format. We don't have to have the Cultivates and the Kodama's Reaches. We can use Cleansing Wildfire. Next on our list, we have Escape the Wilds. This is one of my favorite Gruul cards. It's a very powerful card draw spell and ramp spell. Lets us play an additional land, but even more importantly, lets us exile the top 5 cards of our library, and we can play them until the end of our next turn. So you may think it's downside because they're going to exile. I promise you that's never a downside with this. We are usually going to be able to cast those cards. The next one I want to talk about is Nylea's Lithoforming. Now this is a finisher. I'll talk about how that works in the next section, but this lets us sacrifice lands equal to X, and then we can draw that many cards equal to the number that we sacrificed. Now we can use that to play a ton of additional lands this turn and use this as a big finisher with our commander, but this is also just a good little card draw spell. If we can sack 3 lands, we can play 3 additional lands this turn, but more importantly, we could draw 3 cards. So this is not something you want to do all the time, but in a pinch, this is a great card draw spell. Valakut Exploration is a really fun card draw synergy piece in the landfall strategy. This lets us exile a card whenever we have a landfall trigger. Every time we do that, we're going to be exiling the top card of our library. At the end of our turn, we can also use this as a burn spell to take down our opponents for any of the spells that weren't cast from exile. I think this card can get a little confusing. I remember the first time I read Valakut Exploration. It does seem a little bit confusing because it's a very wordy card for very simple text. It just says landfall. Whenever a land enters, exile the top card of your library. You may play it until the end of this turn. And then at the end of the turn, you have to put those exiled cards in your graveyard. And for each one you do that to, you get to deal 1 damage to your opponent. So if you have 3 cards going to the grave, you get to deal 3 damage to each opponent. The last 2 cards are 2 of the cards that I built this entire deck around. And I want to take a moment to stress, these are probably the 2 most powerful cards in the entire deck. And I just knew whenever I saw our commander's ability and I saw what these kind of cards could do with it, that this was a deck that could really punch above its weight. So the first card we have in this category is going to be Keen Sense. You can enchant a creature, and whenever enchanted creature deals damage to an opponent, you may draw a card. Now, our commander says, whenever a land enters the battlefield, we can deal 1 damage to each opponent. What's really important to know about Keen Sense is that it does not say combat damage. It just says damage, meaning that whenever we deal damage when lands enter with Tanook, we're going to be able to draw cards off of our Keen Sense trigger, and not just 1 card. We're going to draw 1 card for each opponent that took damage. So if all 3 of your opponents are still in play, each one is going to have a card draw trigger. We're going to draw 3 cards off the Keen Sense. Same thing goes for Snake Umbra. You get to enchant a creature, it gets +1/+1, and has, whenever this creature deals damage to an opponent, you may draw a card. So that way, whenever Tanook is dealing damage, we're drawing cards. Snake Umbra also has the ability Totem Armor, which gives us additional protection for our commander, because once you put this on Tanook, it is going to get spicy. You are going to have folks looking at you because they're like, oh no, that guy is drawing a lot of cards. And if you go to a budget game night when people are bringing decks that are about $50 or less, they're going to be surprised how powerful this synergy can be on such a tight budget. So that really does it for the card draw section. Don't forget that our commander is also a card draw engine, so that every time a land enters, that second time we get to draw a card. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the meat and potatoes of this deck. In the landfall strategy, we're talking about how we can play additional lands, how we can get extra lands onto the battlefield, and do as many landfall triggers as we possibly can. We've got this section here of 8. I've already talked about a few of them, but let's go into some of the ones we haven't discussed yet. Azusa's Many Journeys. Its first ability lets us play an additional land this turn. We get to gain some life, and then we get to transform it into a 3/3 human monk that whenever it becomes blocked, we can untap up to 3 lands we control. This can be a really fun piece whenever we go to combat with, but more importantly, it's 2 mana, play an additional land this turn. Broken Bond. It's a removal piece, so we can remove somebody's enchantment or artifact, but then we can also play an additional land and put it from our hand onto the battlefield. We have Zell from the new Final Fantasy set. He lets us play an additional land each turn, but we also have to return a land to our hand at the end of the turn. He lets us not only hit our landfall triggers, but lets us continue to hit those landfall triggers as we have to bounce those lands back to our hand. And last but most certainly not least, I do want to talk about On the Trail. This is a card from Murders at Karlov Manor that is really synergistic with our commander, because whenever we draw our second card, we can put a land from our hand onto the battlefield tapped, but whenever our commander triggers with its second landfall trigger, we're going to be able to draw our second card for turn. So Tanook is going to trigger On the Trail. On the Trail is going to trigger Tanook. It's a really fun kind of wombo combo. And for 2 mana, it's a great little enchantment that's just going to stick around, help us out with landfall triggers. Now, I don't typically like to build decks that have a lot of additional land synergies in landfall. I usually like to have more traditional ramp spells. But in a budget-focused environment, these cards pack a whopping punch. These can really help you out and can continue to help get those lands into play without having to spend mana to do so, or without having to purchase some of the most powerful cards in the format. Now that we've talked about that, let's talk about some of the classic ramp pieces we have in the deck. We have a combination of spells that are a little bit more expensive than you would normally cast in this category, and then also some really kind of out there synergies that I'm kind of dying to tell you a little bit about. Nissa's Expedition. This is 5 mana, but it has Convoke, so we can tap creatures to pay for the colorless or the green, depending on what creature we're tapping for. Search for 2 basics and put them onto the battlefield tapped. Ranger's Path, look for 2 forests, put them onto the battlefield tapped. Reach the Horizon, look for 2 basics or towns with different names, put them onto the battlefield tapped. These are all cards in this 4 mana category with Migration Path, with Explosive Vegetation, with Circuitous Route. These are all 4 mana spells that are going to help us hit 2 landfall triggers at a time. They'll come in after Tanook comes in. Normally we would cast Tanook on 3, and then as we get to that turn 4, we can start casting some of these 4 mana ramp spells. And they also let us bring in 2 lands. We have the ability to hit 2 of those landfall triggers and triggering our commanders card draw effect. Now, we have a couple of other ones that are some more classic ramp pieces that also synergize with sacrificing some of our lands. Springbloom Druid, Dire Strait Rampage, which is a removal piece, but we can also destroy our own land to get 2 basics out of the library. Harrow, which is another classic sack a land, get 2 basics. We've got some other classic ramp spells like Wayfarer's Bauble. We do have a copy of Rampant Growth in this deck and Secure a Tribe Elder. Wood Elves is one of my favorites. A lot of people forget that Wood Elves does not just search for a basic. Wood Elves searches for a forest card. So you can go get any of our dual land forests like Cinderglade, Wooded Ridgeline, and then also our Highland Forest. These are all forests in addition to being mountains, and the land that you get off of Wood Elves is going to come in untapped. So if you want to bring in a basic forest, you can, but I love using it to fix my colors and bringing in some of these forest mountains that are also going to make sure we can tap for red. The next kind of card that I want to talk to you about in this list that normally is not a ramp piece, it is normally a vomit out a bunch of creatures onto your battlefield card, but Genesis Wave is a very powerful card in a deck that runs 43 lands and a ton of other permanents. This is going to be a card where if we pay X, we're going to reveal the top X cards of our library, and we could put any number of permanents with X or less onto the battlefield. So if we have X becoming something like 7 mana, so we pay a total of 10 into this, we have X is 7, we're going to flip over the top 7 cards, and in our deck, those 7 cards are probably going to be a lot of lands. So we're going to be able to hit a ton of landfall triggers. In this deck, you know, we typically would want to run something like Scape Shift, but if we take a second to look at Scape Shift on Scryfall, you can see that the prices for this card are more than the price of the entire deck. So what we're trying to do is, in our budget, find ways to get this type of effect for significantly less. And I think we've done that with some of the cards that we've got in the list here. One of the other cards that I really wanted to talk about, this card is one that I like, and that is Rootweaver Druid. Whenever it enters, each opponent may search their library for 3 basic land cards. They each put one of those onto the battlefield tapped under your control and the rest onto the battlefield tapped under their control. So the math with Rootweaver Druid is that each of your opponents in the end will have ramped 2 lands out of their deck. But if you have 3 opponents in the game, you're going to get 3 lands. I do understand you're giving your opponent some free resources, but we always end up ahead as long as we have 3 opponents. And more importantly, this is less than $1 to hit 3 lands onto the battlefield. And we're actually taking them from our opponent's library, so we're not reducing the number of lands that we could potentially hit in our own deck. The last card I want to talk about that's kind of in this niche category of doing landfall triggers that aren't traditional landfall spells is Jaheira's Respite. This is a fog effect that also lets us get to hit a bunch of basic lands onto our battlefield. Search your library for up to X basic land cards, where X is the number of creatures attacking you. Put those cards onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. Prevent all combat damage that would be dealt this turn. Any combat damage that would be dealt, we get to fog it away, so we're not going to be taking damage. But more importantly, this could have us hit a ton of lands. I know this is a little situational. You know, you're not going to have this hit every single time for a big number like X being, 6 or 7. But if you have even 1 creature swinging at you for lethal and you have 5 mana open, you can fog that damage and go get a basic out of your deck and go ramp out a land for doing so. It's a little overcosted for a fog. It's a little overcosted for a ramp spell that's not necessarily guaranteed to get you something. But this is one of those cheeky cards that on a budget can do a ton of value for you. By the way, if you see this guy, this is my cat. His name is Raymond. This is his room up here. I'm in my loft upstairs. So if you ever see this guy on camera, you just know that he's not in my space. I'm in his space. So when he's here, I don't tell him to leave because this is where he belongs. I don't belong up here, according to him. So let's keep going. I've talked a lot about the way the deck's going to ramp out some lands, how we're going to draw cards. How are we winning the game? Like, what are we doing? Are we just trying to hit Tanook a bunch of times? The reality is that in this budget format, we're not going to be able to hit enough landfall triggers to just win the game outright with Tanook's ability. So instead of trying to go for that, we do have some redundancies for his effect, but we're also going to be leaning into creating an army of creature tokens. So let's quickly go over the redundancies for Tanook's effect in the burn section, and then we'll get into the creature token generators to talk about, now that we know how we're doing all this landfall stuff, how are we winning with it? We have 3 creatures that do exactly what our commander does in Sabatender, Spitfire Lagak, and Tunneling Geopede. Lands enter, we deal 1 damage to each opponent. We also have some ones that are kind of like our commander, but a little bit lighter in Kassi's Ravager. You can deal 1 damage to target player, so doesn't deal the damage to each opponent, but we still get to deal damage to someone. Also, one that I just fell in love with when I was looking at this deck is Akoum Hellkite. This is a 6 mana, 4/4 flying dragon that says landfall. Whenever a land enters, we get to deal 1 damage to any target. But if that land was a mountain, we get to deal 2 damage instead. So Akoum not only is going to be able to deal damage directly to our opponents, but it's going to be a repeatable way to deal damage to our opponent's creatures. And we have a lot of mountains. One of the reasons I intentionally did not lean so heavily into the forests, we only have, 12 forests, we could have run more, is because I want to have a consistent number of potential mountains that we hit so that we can trigger the Akoum Hellkite as a burn spell and a potential removal piece. The other 2 that I've got in this deck we talked about before with Valakut Exploration, but I also want to talk about the angry jellybean himself, Omnath, Locust of Rage. So whenever a land enters, we get to create a 5/5 green elemental creature token, but if one of those elementals dies, we get to deal 3 damage to any target. Now, we don't have cards in the deck that are intentionally sacrificing those, but these creatures could potentially die in combat. They can die to a board wipe. There's many ways that these creatures could end up leaving the battlefield, and if they do, we're going to be able to deal 3 damage to any target. So that's mostly going to be people's face. So now let's talk about the token generators. These are not necessarily best in class, but they are really skilled and powerful at what they do. We've got Faldorn, Dreadwolf Herald, Chocobo Racetrack, Elfsworn Giant, Spore Mound, Zaktar Shrine Expedition, the Nesting Dragon, Phylath, World Sculptor, Rampaging Balos, a Landfall classic. I think I've died to this card so many times. This card is really good. We've got Omnath, Locust of Rage, once again, the Avenger of Zendikar, and last, but certainly not least, Titania, Nature's Force. These are all creatures that whenever a land enters, and depending on what type of land it is, they're going to have a trigger that lets us create a creature token. So as we're doing all of our synergies, we're dealing damage with our commander, we're creating an army of tokens, we can go out for the win. One of the most popular things to do in a landfall strategy is to play lands out of your graveyard. But kind of like what I just did with Scape Shift, if we look up cards like Crucible of Worlds, we're going to see that Crucible of Worlds is just about as expensive as our deck is. I think the cheapest copy that I see here is worth $24. It's really hard to justify running these cards in our deck when we have a very tight budget. But we have some ways of doing land recursion that are going to be on a budget. So the first is going to be with Erinys Gloomstalker. Whenever she attacks, we can return a target land from our graveyard to the battlefield. We also have Restore. This lets us put a land from our graveyard onto the battlefield. We have Yadara, Grave Gardener. Whenever one of our non-token creatures dies, we return it to the battlefield face down, and it's a land. It's a forest, and those do come in and trigger all of our landfall triggers. So whenever our creatures die, we're going to be able to bring them back as lands that trigger all of our other shenanigans. And finally, talking about Titania again in this recursion section, we can play forests from our graveyard. So we're not able to play all the different land types like we would with a Crucible of Worlds or a Ruminop Excavator, but we are able to get some of our lands back. And we don't have just the 12 forests. We also can include all of our tapped dual lands in that conversation. So whenever we play one of our tapped dual lands out of the graveyard that's a forest, it also works with Titania. And it's a very synergistic way of saying, okay, I know that we're on a budget. I know that we can't get some of the best in class cards, but we've got some cards that are still pretty good at bringing stuff back for the graveyard. The last thing I do want to talk about is just going over a little bit of the removal package. I did talk about cards like Akum Hellkite, and I did also talk about some of these other cards, but because we're in a budget, I do have to talk about the fact that some of these cards are just not going to be as good as you would want them to be. For example, we have Airship Crash. Now, this is a removal spell that lets us hit artifacts and enchantments, and it has the narrow ability to hit creatures with flying. If we can't find an artifact or an enchantment to remove, we can pay 2 mana, get rid of this out of our hand, and go draw into hopefully something a little bit better. We have classics like Abrade, Reclamation Sage. We also have the best in class, which is Beast Within. We do have Chaos Warp as well in the deck. In terms of board wipes, it gets a little bit difficult because we don't have access to cards like Blasphemous Act. Blast Act would be the best option in this deck, but we've got some alternatives that can still do the job in Decimate and in Chain Reaction. Now, Chain Reaction is the better version of this because we are a tokens deck. We're going to be making a bunch of little creature tokens with our landfall triggers. And Decimate is obviously not the best in class in terms of board wipes. It doesn't really wipe the board of everything. It hits a few specific targets, but for 50 cents, it can do quite a bit of work. And if we have to, we can use our land as the target. I know that, if you're playing in a bracket 2 game, land destruction is something that people can get a little bit upset with. And I know that Decimate has to target a land. So just target yourself with the land. Put it in your graveyard. Use Tatiova to get it back out of the graveyard. Use one of our other recursion pieces to hit your landfall trigger. But just know that Decimate and Chain Reaction are in the deck as board wipes, but I know that they're not best in class. But we have a tight budget, and I think we did a very good job of doing it. And in fact, literally as of recording this video, we've had the price drop about $1 or $2. So $46.07 is the total cost for our deck here. So thanks for watching this deck tech on Tanook Memorial Ensign and how you can build a budget Gruul landfall list around it. This has been Keen Expedition. I just wanted to take the time to say thank you for watching this video. I'm really appreciative you stuck around here to the end. My goal is to build a community here and on other social platforms where we talk about Commander, we talk about deck building. I've gotten a lot from joining this hobby and building relationships with folks, building and having a creative outlet for building decks. And so if you're also like-minded in that way, please, subscribe to this channel. I'm going to be building decks. I'm going to build decks that are all over the place. I'll talk about some of the decks I currently own, some of the commanders from each set, pre-con upgrade guides, all kinds of stuff like that. And if you enjoyed this video, leave it a like. Let me know what you think down in the comments section. And like I said, most importantly, subscribe. I'm on the road to 1,000 subscribers so we can do things like live streams and other channel-related activities. So honestly, if you can subscribe, that would mean a lot. Again, my name is ClearReason. I'll see you next time.